latest science has to say about how you can train and prepare effectively for your sport and towards your sporting goals? Well, if not, that's fine, because that's what this podcast is here to do. And each week we'll delve into the science, take out a particular study, look at what it's researched, and then apply that to you and to a real-world sporting environment in the hope that it will help you to move towards your goals more effectively and to enjoy your sport more. I'll be doing this with my good friend and fellow coach Scott Finley, who, as well as being a coach to real-world athletes just like you, is also a PhD student who understands the science behind the research articles that we're looking at. And this week we look into a study that looks at the training of age group multisport athletes at a World Age Group Championships and the impact their training has on stress throughout the training cycle. It's a really interesting conversation which has direct application for athletes and also coaches, and we produce a nice little model at the back of the science to help you be able to structure your training so that it's optimized for you and not just taken from a general model which might not be right for your specific situation. It's a really interesting listen, so stick with it and hope you enjoy the next 35 or 40 minutes as we take the science and apply it to you.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Elevate Multisport Academy podcast. This week we are looking at a paper called Work, Training and Life Stress in ITU World Olympic Distance Age Group Championship Triathletes. So before we get started, we'll do some quick fire questions for Joel. You ready?
I am always ready.
Good. Should all forms of stress be considered when planning training?
Yes.
Does everyone respond to a stressor in the same way?
No.
And finally, should people try to copy training that they see elites doing?
I like that we don't rehearse these questions because they put me on the spot, which is what I asked you to do, so that's a good thing. No, they should not necessarily.
So I was going to say, there's probably a caveat in there. We can maybe get into that.
That's a caveat. You can learn some stuff from them. Don't assume it's exactly right for you. That's my one sentence answer.
Moving slightly away from the quick fire question, but no, I'll allow it.
Thanks.
Okay, so very quickly, what the study was about, methods and results. So we've got 48 participants who had raced at the World Age Group Championships. Majority of participants were 35 and over. Average training background of 13 years in swimming, 10 years in cycling. And they placed from 2nd to 122nd within their respective age groups. So as I said, they basically completed this questionnaire looking at a whole range of things that range from their medical history to the training in the build up to the race. Importantly, their life stress and the kind of level of coaching support. There was a whole load of other things as well, as we'll get into. There was a lot of data here, so
yeah, it's a massive study. We were talking like before we recorded about this is like 31 pages of a study, and it just looks like a massive data dump that it's taken them about 10 years to sift through. And Scott suggested probably COVID gave them the opportunity to maybe sift through the data and get this thing published. So there's a lot in there. We'll try and keep it as interesting as we can.
Yeah, perfect. So just before we go into the results, can you just give us a quick explanation of what life stress is, just for context?
I'm going to ask you to add to this probably, because I don't think my definition is going to be that adequate. But life stress in this case is everything that causes a load of stress on whoever it might be, on the athletes in the study. And so it's not just looking at sports stress, it's looking at work stress. And Scott, I remember you did a really good talk a while ago when we were coaching together, and you were looking at the influence of stress on heart rate variability. And you were saying about how when you broke your foot and like the impact on HRV that implicated potentially a stress response in the body. Similarly, a late night, a party, an argument at work, other things. So it's all of that stuff that adds a kind of an emotional load that might increase an elevation of cortisol in the body and that physiological stress response. So here we're talking about all of that stuff, not just sports specific stress.
Yeah, exactly. No, that was perfect. The only thing I'll add is that obviously they had to use a questionnaire to measure this, and the categories they had in that were sports, relationship, personal, and career. So it's exactly that. Okay, so into the results. Almost half of the participants were regularly training with a single sport specialist, so they might have been swimming in a swimming club rather than a tri club. Most people received club-based coaching. 95.8% of the athletes indicated that they had set goals for the season. 78% said they had a periodized plan for the season. Joel, do you want to just remind listeners what periodization is?
Yes, thank you. We spoke in podcast 1, maybe?
1 or 2,
podcast
yeah.
1 or 2, I don't know. One of the first 2. Go back and find out if you're listening about what periodization was. And essentially, it's broadly speaking, it's just how you structure training. A classic periodization model, and I always struggle to say it, is kind of high volume, moving through towards higher intensity, lower volume, the closer you get to your competition. There's the reverse periodization model as well, which is just the opposite. You do all the hard stuff first, and then as you get closer to the competition, you do longer and longer stuff as well. And so the athletes in this study were found to have planned a sort of structure, a periodization model for this, and we'll talk maybe a little bit later about what they actually did.
Yep, no, that's perfect. They had an average of 1.7 hours of training per day. I've got a wee quote here from them that I thought was quite important. We did not assess time spent looking after family members and children in particular within the survey. So I think we'll maybe try and remember to come back to that at the end, because I think I saw there was a post on the Elevate community page asking a similar question about that. During the weekday for all sports, almost 25% of training was completed between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m., with the other biggest percentage being completed before 9 a.m. I mean, that kind of probably resonates with most triathletes, get stuff done before and after work.
Yeah, that would surprise me. I have to be honest. I thought that the majority was going to be in the morning, like by quite a big percentage. I would thought people would get up, do it, and then maybe do a bit of supplementary stuff in the evening. But, after a tiring day of work, not so much. That's just my experience of my training. So it was a really interesting window on the world for me to find out that the majority of people do it the other way, or that at least a lot of training happens in the evening. Because for me, I'm kind of done by about 6:30 p.m. if I'm honest.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, I suppose, is the time window is 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. I think there's a huge difference between training at 6 p.m. and finishing at, training at 9 and finishing at 10. I mean, particularly in terms of stress. So
and stress related to the fact that then that's going to impact sleep. It's going to impact eating. Like if you're finishing training at even 9 o'clock, let alone 10 o'clock, when are you eating a recovery meal? And if you're eating it straight away because you need to recover, that makes sense, ticking that box, but you're probably also going to impact sleep, which is another box that you should also be prioritizing as well. So, I think as soon as I find you cramming training into the evening, you're risking affecting a lot of other important training factors like diet, sleep, both of those related to stress as well. So, it's a possible take home that where the majority of people are shoving it into the evening, it might be better if we can do more training earlier in the day.
A couple more, 70.8% said they were receiving feedback on their training from a coach. So that could be being coached or just within a club environment. And then finishing off with a couple of comments about the stress measurements. So across the group, 39.7% of their total life stress was considered to be positive, and 60.4% was considered to be negative. And the breakdown of what contributed to that stress was sports was 42%, relationships 12.7%, personal 31.3%, and career 14%. So sports-related stress contributing quite a lot to that. And actually the negative sports-related stress was same. It was 60% of the sports-related stress they thought was negative. With the two highest factors in that were related to injury, and the third one was actually related to not achieving their goals. Just a kind of obvious question here: do we not set goals because we don't want to get stressed and annoyed when we don't achieve them? Is that the lesson we should take from this?
The controversial answer is maybe.
Okay.
look, there's the goal setting element of sport is huge, and so I'll obviously direct people towards the Six Keys course, which we've got online, which starts to discuss appropriate and positive goal setting. There will be in the off season, as I've said before, another specific goal setting specific course coming out, and it's worthwhile diving into because how you set your goals is very personal, and whether you the type of goals you set and how kind of structured and rigorous they are is very individualized. There is a vast swathe of people that set goals and those goals are not correct. And I speak on the Six Keys course about my experience of having disordered goals and essentially aspiring to things that, with all the best will in the world, I probably wasn't capable of doing. And so I ended up feeling disappointed for, like years in sport because all I was doing was not achieving. Actually, I was achieving loads.
Mm.
Almost all the time. I was progressing, I was doing better, I was learning loads. The goal was the thing that broke my perception of my sporting achievement, whatever it was, to whatever level it was. So we need appropriate goals, I would say is very useful. We need to make sure that those goals are relevant and appropriate for our level and achievable and as controllable as possible. There is another level to that let me deviate slightly. We also talk about failure in sport and how failure in sport can be a really positive thing. You win or you learn. Failure is a learning opportunity, and that's true. So we can fail and feel bad about it because our goals were broken, or because we don't do the work. We can fail and use that as an opportunity to learn and grow and develop and see failure positively, so we can kind of reframe it. And I think that's a really good place for people to aim to be, because then kind of doesn't really matter whether we hit the goal or not, there's a positive outcome. But there is an angle where we go, actually, I won't have any expectations today, or my expectations will be very, very achievable. So there's an Olympic swimmer who swims for America. I can't remember her name, but she reached the final and I think won a medal in Tokyo. And her entire approach to racing is, I have no expectations. I'm going to go in and I'm going to swim. And she might go as far as, I'm going to swim as well as I can. And she's one of the best swimmers in the world. And I remember the commentators on the BBC and the Tokyo Olympics saying, this is mad. Like, how can this be? Why wouldn't you aspire to win? But actually, she loved her sport as a result and was really good at it because there wasn't pressure. So the stress was reduced. And we can see from what you said earlier, the results. If 60% of life stress is coming from sport, potentially, or no, 40% maybe from sport, but 60% of that is negative.
Yeah.
We want to eliminate as much of that as possible. So potentially really bringing the level of the goal down is a potentially very, very useful way to not fail as much and therefore reduce the stress that we find from sport. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think you're absolutely right. And the middle option you said, which I think was being able to reframe your goal if you don't achieve it and take the positives from it. That's really difficult to do. That takes prep work. You can't just not achieve your goal and then go, oh well,
yeah,
let's move on. You need to sort of work at that. So when you're setting the goals, it's about understanding how achievable it is and things like that, particularly in the midst of a stressful situation. If you are either after a race or in the middle of a stressful week, it's really difficult to remain focused and kind of rational about things. It's quite easy to oh well, my season's ruined. I've got an injury or whatever it was. That's the season completely derailed. Quite easy to jump ship.
Yeah, I absolutely think it is. So there's an application for coaches here. So in the last few podcasts, we've drawn out quite a lot of application for coaches. And I think that you can listen to this as a coach and probably take some things, and as an athlete, maybe take different things. As a coach, I think that's part of our coaching role, is to be mentors and help people to reframe, because as you said, it's incredibly difficult to do on our own. I also think as well, you said it is a process. It's not something that you can probably just shrug off and just do. As you said, it's something that probably needs to be written down and taken time over, and that's the crucial thing.
Mm-hmm.
Very unlikely you can bounce out of what is initially a disappointing emotional response and just reframe it quickly. And there's an application for coaches and athletes, which is sometimes you just have to grieve for a little while, because we're talking about age group world championships here, right? This is probably a big thing for the majority of people if it goes wrong at this kind of level, but it could be anyone's goal at any level of performance. This is not exclusive to, you know, how fast you are in the sport. If there is a disappointment, that positive reframe, as well as being a process, can take time, and it's okay to just feel really gutted for a while. Just don't languish in it or make it last longer than it needs to.
Yeah.
Excuse me interrupting the conversation for just 20 seconds. If you're new to the platform, there are 3 things you can do. When you finish listening to the podcast, take our 6 keys to unlocking your potential course. It's completely free. Then please sign up to the Team Elevate community. It's a great place to meet like-minded athletes who are on a learning journey just like you. And thirdly, if you liked what you found, you can sign up to our monthly membership plan, which gives you access to all of our resources, both now and in the future. So we hope to see you there soon.
And I think you're talking about the coach's role there as well. And I know we talked before that the coach has that role. You'd made the point about the coach giving praise. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because that's kind of related here as well.
Yeah, so while we're on the stress point, so there were various areas that got drawn out as being contributors to the negative stress that the athletes experienced. And 2 of those specific to coaches were a lack of praise from coaches and also team relationships. So as a coach in a club setting or as a one-to-one coach, you know, we have a tremendous responsibility, especially for coaches who deal with junior athletes, because essentially people buy into us, especially if we have a long-standing working relationship, and we have the power to speak truth over people. So if we say, we have to be very careful with, I think, how we speak to our athletes, because what we say can have a big effect. So positivity, not just praise for the sake of it, but helping to support and care for an athlete is a really big, this study suggests, and I think it makes sense, it's a really big part of the experience an athlete has. It's a big contributor to their stress, and we can help them to be less stressed and enjoy their sport more if we are compassionate, supportive, positive, and those kind of things. And that also reflects, just to that second point, of the team relationship. So if we're a club coach, if we run a club or a squad or a group of athletes, building those team relationships can also be a really positive thing, which reduces stress.
And definitely. And to link those 2 points, I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago with a elite coach. I can't remember who it was he was coaching, but he was a fairly junior guy, or he was just starting to make moves into the ITU series. And he finished a race and had a terrible race. And the coach said to him, "Oh, you did well, better luck next time." Or, tried to be supportive and kind of give him the positives. And that annoyed the athlete, because the athlete wanted blunt, honest feedback. So I think that the point I'm trying to make is that, it links, the relationship is really important, because you know what the athlete needs. So providing feedback is not just, as you say, not just praise for praise sakes. It's feedback and support that the athlete wants or knows they need.
Yeah, I said support first and positivity last for a reason. I think they're both important, but we just need to be more careful with the positivity, but support always plays a role.
Yeah.
And before we move on from the stress thing as well, so for athletes, the pressure to lose weight is that's an interesting one. So that was a big negative pressure that caused that kind of increase of stress, negative stress response in athletes. I guess coaches as well, there's an implication there, right? There's also a cultural implication. There's an implication for us as athletes with teammates. To be careful around that. We also need to be very honest about whether people do or don't need to lose weight, particularly in female athletes, as we spoke about in, again, an earlier podcast. If you want to go back and listen, we're getting to plug our own work now. We've done so many of these.
Yeah.
Good. We can loop back. Success. The importance of female athletes, particularly being stronger and heavier rather
Yeah.
than lighter and weaker. We want to push people in that direction. So as coaches, as athletes, if we have that knowledge, we can move away from that model of just lighter is better. It's almost definitely not, especially in time trial type racing, which is what this study looked at and what a lot of age groupers do. I'm talking too much, so quickly. Less social interaction was an increased stress, so we want to maintain our social life. Injury, an obvious one, but again, we want to make sure that if we can limit injury, then that's great. So training better, more strength and conditioning, more rehab, prehab, those kind of things are important. And yeah, those were the things that the sort of contributors. So they're the areas to pay attention to, I think.
Yeah, and one of the injury ones also mentioned illness. I think it was, being sidelined from training with injury and illness and stress go so hand in hand. That's why it's a real, if you think that illness will derail your training because you should not be training with certain levels of illness.
Yeah.
So if you overtrain to the point that you're getting ill and then recover and then you're stressed, so you're training more, so you're going to get ill again.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle. It's about managing that training load so you don't get ill in the first place.
Yeah. As you speak and as I list out all those things, you kind of see how interrelated they are as well.
Yeah.
Your nutrition's poor, so you get a bit lighter. So maybe you increase the risk of injury, and then you feel a bit more depressed. So you don't go to training, and you lose relationship with your teammates, and you don't get the positive affirmation from your coach and all these things. And we've got to be aware of all of these elements that are important, this study says, and we as coaches know, and pay attention to making sure we're putting money in the pot of each of these things, really, because then they build on each other and send us in an upward circle rather than a downward spiral.
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick point around this being done in 2013. I know we said that we said that already. It was done over 10 years ago. That's, we've talked about, they did their training here and they did their training, in the mornings and the evenings. I suspect there might be some changes to those patterns now. I know people are being drawn back to work now, but this was a long time pre-COVID, and now there are a lot more people working from home, so might be a bit more flexible about fitting training in during the day.
Yes, and that again is another contributing factor to the stress as well. So I suppose if team relationships are important, then there's an element that we want to make sure that we're still training with people, if that's important for a particular athlete. But also we now potentially have the opportunity to fit work around training, at least sometimes, a little bit more flexibility than there was 10, 11 years ago. So that feels important. If training late is a symptom of stress, then we need to make sure that we do something about it, because stress is bad and it inhibits performance.
Yeah, that sort of blends nicely into the next section. I said we'd maybe come back to speaking about managing lifestyle and training with kids. So yeah, someone asked a comment or asked a question about fitting training in amongst the family, work, young kids, all that sort of stuff. I don't know whether you want to sort of say some of the things that you thought, or whether I just have a quick go at it.
Let's both jump in a little bit. So in this study, the researchers highlight quite a lot of issues with the study, and one of them is that they didn't really look at this area of the stress that came from looking after families. But we know that young children, we know that having families is going to take a lot of time. Most of the time, I think it's it's positive stress. I guess it's really nice to have kids and have family, and I think we need to consciously view that as such. So I think the first thing is to not get to the point, and it's a red flag if anyone listening, any athlete gets to the point where something like family is a negative stress because it gets in the way of sport. Sport and training and stuff, we're athletes, we know is important, but obviously it needs to be held in balance with other stuff, and family feels like that should be the number one. Practically, though, we need to make sure that those things are sit in harmony and alongside each other as easily as they possibly can. And that's the solution, really. So if we think about all of the, the Atomic Habits, James Clear stuff, if we want good habits, we need to make things as easy as possible, right? So we've got to look at how we can fit the sport around the family in the easiest possible way. For me, it was I bought a treadmill and a turbo. And that meant that when my daughter was a baby, I could do my training while I was also looking after her, and she was in the bouncer or whatever, and she was happy, and I didn't have to go out of the house. Simple things like that, life hacks to make it as easy as possible. It's one of the things that elites do better than age groupers is they make their training as easy as possible. And so I think we need to work out how to do that for ourselves.
Yeah, and one of the things for me about how to make it easy is having that schedule or that routine, which makes it easier when you're involved with a club, because you know that Tuesday morning is swim. That's sort of pre-agreed with spouse. Tuesday mornings you watch the baby because I'm going to go and swim. Again, with the caveat that baby was up all night crying, wife is tired, I'll watch the baby and wife can sleep. There's that balance, but having a routine for yourself, I'm getting up tomorrow and I'm running. Having that time set aside where everyone knows what's happening, I think is really useful, because it doesn't need to be a 2-hour bike or a 90-minute run or whatever it is. It's what can you manage. I took this section from the kind of the conclusion of the study, which was they kind of mentioned that the question shouldn't be necessarily about whether classic polarized training is ideal for triathlon, about which model is best versus this versus that. The question is about what is the best training practice that a given age group athlete can feasibly achieve given his or her work and other commitments. Which I think is it kind of nicely summarizes the idea there that it's about fitting in with what you can do what you can.
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to those periodization theories, it's a case of all models are wrong, some are useful. That kind of old adage is really useful. Let's talk about that. And before we do, I would say that if anyone is a multi-sport athlete who has a family and is working anywhere near full-time or shift work, firstly, if you haven't gone to the level of basically having a spreadsheet to manage your time, you might not be doing it right. That I say in jest, but one of the genuine things that has been pretty life-changing for us as a family in terms of managing all of this stuff and reducing stress is admin night. Now that sounds really dull because there's not a whole night. It's usually about 20 minutes or half an hour, but it is the schedule. We schedule a discussion where we basically plan through the next week or couple of weeks. And what that means is that it doesn't happen on date night. So if you block out time for training and you block out time for family, you block out time for date night, if you don't block out the time to actually admin your life, I find that then date night turns into that and you end up with no quality time with your partner or spouse. So the life hack of scheduling time for admin planning every week is crucial. And what it means is that really boring 20 minutes that I absolutely hate makes the rest of my week much easier. So people can have that for free.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, a less intense version of that is just a shared calendar. That might be a gateway to adding admin night. But something, I think you're quite right. I think having something like that is necessary.
I think so. To pick up your last point, so let's get a little bit practical as we kind of round off and come to the end of the podcast for this week. We definitely need to move away from this idea of just a particular model. And what we see the athletes in this study do generally are there's two things to draw out in terms of the training that was found to happen. So in general, athletes moved as a group, this is, so no one individual, so be careful with the application, from kind of high volume, sort of lower level training or lower intensity training to lower volume, higher intensity training. So they were doing harder work the closer they got to the competition. However, recovery closer to the competition was also worse, which suggests that the work they were doing was potentially too hard close to the competition, because recovery was at a point where it seemed like it was inhibited. But what we also see is that across the study, athletes were doing, so they split athlete training intensity into 3 zones. So some people might use 5 or 7 zone training models. Here, they were looking at zone 1, essentially aerobic, no lactate being produced. Zone 2, the kind of the lactatey bit between where you start producing lactate, but it's fine, and your body can't cope with the amount of lactate. And then zone 3 was anything beyond that. And across this study, athletes were spending 53% of time in zone 1, 33% of time in zone 2, and 14% of time in zone 3, which suggests a kind of lot, like it's not very polarized. It's a bit of everything all at the same time. It didn't really change much through the study. But when we looked at the fastest athletes, they were doing 71% in zone 1 and like 6 in zone 2 and 9% in zone 3. We don't understand the maths because that doesn't add up to 100. But broadly speaking, you can see that there was a lot more polarization. So we've ended up with a bunch of athletes who are doing a lot of stuff all the time without very much structure. The data says no, they can't really see any kind of pattern or plan in it. And I think the take homes are these. So Scott, I'll let you come back to me on this in a second. But for athletes who are listening, at the beginning of a season, you need to have a think about what is like a manageable load that fits around life. So that comes back to that kind of planning stuff. How much can you do? When can you do it? What is realistic? That's step 1. And step 2 is to think, well, what do I need to do training wise? What do I need to do to be better prepared for whatever my goal is? Whatever that event is, whatever level it is, however fast you want to be, however far away it is, what is the work I need to do? List all of those things out. And then kind of number 3, but really just an extension of 2, is ordering those things from least race specific to most race specific. So you might need to get stronger, but that might not be really race specific. So you do that, but you do it first. You might need threshold work, and that's really race specific. So you do that closest to the race. And then what we end up with through that 2-stage process is a bunch of training that you can achieve and that is specific to you, and that also moves towards being specific to the race. How have I explained that, Scott? Did it make sense?
Yes, it did. And no, that's a nice, simple concept that I'm going to sort of complicate slightly further by adding so that's the kind of overview, isn't it? That's your season overview. Within that, you've also got to consider intensity versus time distribution. So if you're doing standard periodization, which is getting or traditional periodization, you're getting faster or more intense as you go because you're doing a sprint race. You are going to be adding more and more stress as you go. So it's important that if you're doing 15 hours a week of training in the endurance phase, it's about making sure that you can manage to do an appropriate amount of intensity in the later stages. So maybe you can, maybe by the time you've added that fitness, maybe you can manage 15 hours with intensity. But as Joel was saying there, it's about reconsidering that, what position you're in there. Can you manage that load with the higher intensity?
So I take that and I think, right, how can I put that into my life? And the way I kind of unpack that, Scott, is to say, when the training is more stressful, whatever that means, because it might be through volume or it might be through intensity, I need to make sure that I balance that in the rest of my life, because I only have the capacity for a certain amount of stress. And so I think it's a case of paying attention to, when there's going to be that pinch of intensity, whatever that looks like, or not intensity, of load through training, and how do we compensate that in the rest of life? And we kind of, again, bring that back round to the importance of making sure that we obviously don't get injured. The social side is still in check. We're feeling positive and supported through our network and through our coaches, and those things are going to help us fill up us, increase our capacity for the load and the stress, basically.
Yeah.
So that then we can do the work.
Yeah, because that's the thing. It might be that, you say about managing the rest of your life stress. It might be that nothing else can budge. If sports is a hobby for you, which for the vast majority of us it is,
mm-hmm.
That's often the thing that needs to budge in terms of stress.
Yeah.
So it's, again, as you said, it's about setting an appropriate level of load for the life stress that you have or you will have.
Yeah, definitely. And we come back to sharing that load as well. So making sure that the team is on board, making sure that the family is on board, making sure you've hedged out that time. And one last stat, which we haven't mentioned yet, is I think 27% of athletes in this study were coached, which blows my mind, So that means that we've got, 73%, what's my maths like? 73% of people are doing this on their own. They don't necessarily have a mentor or someone who they can check in with, who they can help and rely on, who can help them and who they can rely on to kind of unpack all of this stuff and keep them on the straight and narrow. I think mentoring and coaching is always really key in this process, and managing all of this stuff as well as it flies around us.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and a great point to finish on. So thank you very much, Joel. Thank you very much for listening. And we will be back again next week for another podcast.
Well, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.